Hello and welcome. It's a special treat, and you clearly have drawn a huge crowd to have Haleh here with us. I do want to thank her, and also on behalf of Alma and Joe Gildenhorn. You know Joe very well as from this book. He's the chair of the Wilson Center. Her brother died yesterday, so she couldn't be with us, but she sponsors these events. And the book is My Prison, My Home. I think everybody knows, hey, Fred, the wonderful, the horrifying story with the wonderful ending that this represents, your captivity in Iran. And maybe we can just start with a few questions, and I'm going to open it up. But I particularly enjoyed reading in the book about you being born in Tehran and growing up there. So why don't we start at the beginning?
I was born in Tehran in 1940. I don't have any problem with my age because everybody knew I was then the 67-year-old grandmother. So, and now I'm almost
Probably made
70.
you sound less
Yes.
dangerous.
No, you will be surprised. Even President Ahmadinejad referred to me a couple of weeks ago saying, I don't understand why the Minister of Intelligence arrested this 70-year-old woman.
Great.
And accused her of fomenting a velvet revolution. And that was one of the reasons he sacked his intelligence minister, so he said.
Really? I didn't know
So
that.
we can get to that later. But anyway, I was born in Iran. My mother was Austrian, my father Iranian. So I grew up being very comfortable into cultures. A European culture and an Iranian culture. And in those days, Iran was a much calmer society than it is now, and even a calmer country. It was during the reign of the previous regime, the monarchy, and Iran was slowly progressing. And I was part of that society that saw
Well, tell me about the Women's Organization of Iran, because
Yeah.
that's an example of that in the book.
Exactly. The Women's Organization of Iran basically traces its roots in the early 20th century, but the main changes, the main progress took place in the previous regime. And it was then that women got the right to vote. Women had access to employment. Women had equal access to education. But as you know, Walter, the biggest obstacle in the region for women, including Iran, is the personal status law. And in 1967, the existing personal status law was changed in Iran. So raising the age of marriage girls to 18, giving the right of divorce to women, child custody was given to women, and other major changes. So.
And why did you end up leaving Iran?
The revolution. I had left Iran before the revolution to go and spend a couple of weeks in England with our then 13-year-old daughter. My husband was a university professor, stayed in Iran. And then once the revolution happened, he kept on calling me and telling me the schools, our daughter went to an American school, said they closed the school, so maybe you stay a little bit longer, maybe you put Haleh in school and wait to see what will happen. And I was then working for a cultural foundation, and they had arrested and imprisoned the head of that foundation. So my colleagues also said, you know, why don't you wait it out and see what will happen? And then very soon I found out that it was not safe for us to take our daughter back. And then my husband left too because he got an appointment at Princeton, and then we moved to Princeton.
And you went to Princeton as well?
Yes.
And what did you do at Princeton?
I was teaching Persian language and contemporary Persian literature, and also a course in Iranian women's studies.
Mm-hmm. And then moved to the Wilson Center?
I came to the Wilson Center on a sabbatical really to write a book on the women's movement in Iran. And by then, my husband was teaching here at George Mason, so we were living in Washington, and I was the commuter spouse. So I was offered to set up the Middle East program at the Wilson Center on a part-time basis. So I would continue teaching in Princeton, but also working at the center. But then gradually the job became too much. The commute became too hard. So I decided to quit Princeton, and I stayed at the Wilson
And you're
Center.
traveling back to Iran to see your family some?
All the time. I mean, I'd say for the last now 17 years, I had been going to Iran regularly, first once a year, then twice a year, then 3-4 times a year to spend time with my parents. As they grew older, I had to spend more time with them. And the trips were very uneventful and very ordinary trips. I would just go as a visitor, spend time with my family, never stayed more than 2 weeks, and would return.
And you were not there trying to overthrow the government of Iran in a surreptitious way?
Definitely not, because I found it really very amusing that a 67-year-old woman who is not even barely 5 feet tall and doesn't weigh 105 pounds would try and overthrow the mightiest power in the Persian Gulf. And I kept on telling them this, but they didn't believe me.
You say they were uneventful. Then comes the robbery.
Yes. And then comes December 30th, 2006. Having spent a week with my mother in Tehran, spent Christmas together, I was heading home. And then
to the airport.
On the road to the airport, a car pulled in front of us and basically stopped our car. And 3 knife-wielding men jumped out of the car, and one took my suitcase from the trunk, the other one took my carry-on bag from the front seat, and the third one came and sat next to me and started going through my purse. And I thought, really, this is a robbery. Tehran is a big city with 14 million inhabitants, so it happens. Such things happened all the time. So I said, please take everything. Just leave me my ticket and my passport, because I'm traveling tonight. I mean, I was so naive, really. And I looked at him, and it was dark, and all I saw were his glasses and his grin on his face. And then he sort of leaned towards me and started going through my coat pockets. And for a brief moment, I thought, this is the Islamic Republic of Iran. A stranger is not supposed to touch you. And there is this guy going through my pocket. And then he left the car. And they took my purse too. And I noticed that I'm a paperless person. Having studied in Austria, I'd met a lot of refugees who didn't have any papers. And for a brief moment, I felt like them.
Did it occur to you then that this was not a robbery? And when did you start figuring it out?
No, it didn't occur to me then.
I mean, it was a robbery.
Yeah, I was happy to be alive, to be honest. You know, I was happy to be alive. I was happy that they had not kidnapped me, they had not beaten me. But maybe 48 hours later, because the next day I went to apply for a passport. And I filled in all the necessary papers, and I was told to come back the next day. So the next day when I went there, and I was told to go to the president's office. The president's office is a name for the intelligence ministry branches. And the intelligence ministry branch in the passport office is called the president's office. So I knew that something was wrong. And then when I went there and I was asked to step into the next room for just for a chat, and the content of the chat was not your regular questions regarding losing a passport, I knew I was in trouble.
And there was certainly a paranoia that you noticed when they were interrogating you.
Sure. I noticed the sense of paranoia within the first couple of weeks of my interrogation, because I was then, after that first encounter with the representative of the intelligence ministry, I was asked to go to another building, which was officially known as a headquarters of the intelligence ministry. And then I would go every day for 8 hours, sometimes 9 hours. And in that context of Q&A, I found out that there is a sense of paranoia, a concern that the United States is planning to overthrow the regime through soft means. And this was in 2007, of course, during the rogue state and axis of evil and so on. And Congress had allocated $75 million to promote democracy in Iran. All that had created a sense of paranoia among the intelligence ministry people. And I was then asked to explain what the plan is.
They sometimes say that even paranoids have enemies.
Yeah.
There was a tiny bit of truth to this, not about you, but about the fact that money was being appropriated to undermine
Sure.
the regime in Iran
Sure.
by the U.S. through civil society programs.
Sure.
And in some ways it was very upfront.
Sure.
Because we want to develop civil society in Iran and hope that that will produce more human rights and eventually a better governance there. Is that a mistake to go down that route, or?
In the case of Iran, it was a mistake because, first of all, the civil society in Iran was a very indigenous movement and had nothing to do with encouragement from the West or the United States. It really happened from within the society. And the civil society was very active in Iran, and we were constantly in touch. Western institutions were in touch with them. We would invite them to come to conferences, and they would come, and there was a lot of exchange workshop. But the moment the money was allocated to promote democracy in Iran, government money, USG money was allocated to promote democracy and to help civil society, it raised the flag. And it started worrying the government. And don't forget, by then the Khatami period was over, and it was Ahmadinejad's presidency, who himself was feeling constantly under pressure and was also paranoid.
We were caught in that here, if I might bring it up, because we had a normal exchange program with the Iranians. Sure. Some of the people in this room were there, the Haleh brothers, talking about medical and AIDS. It was a scientific medical thing. We did it absolutely up front. I always spoke to, can't remember his name, the Iranian ambassador at the UN to let him know what was happening. And yet, at a certain point, some of the people got arrested, and we said, whoa, this is something we're not sure we want to touch. And obviously there was government monies involved in different aspects of, bringing over scholars. But I began to wonder, where's the line here, and where are we causing problems instead of just having an exchange of scientific visitors? So.
They were very suspicious of Aspen, just like they were suspicious of the Wilson Center, of Brookings, of Harvard, MIT, you name it. They had a whole list, and I had...
And rightfully so.
Yeah. And I had to explain each of these institutions, and of course I didn't know how they work and so on. And all they had to do is to go on their website and find out
what they were... I hate to interrupt, but there's one of the priceless moments in the book where you're being forced to explain the Soros Foundation.
Yeah.
And with all due respect, you don't know the Soros Foundation, what it really does or anything else. So finally they print out everything from the web and translate it and give it to you so that you can explain it.
Exactly.
I'm thinking, whoa.
That's right. But there was this sense that the United States really was enemy of Iran. And there has been this enmity for the last 30 years between this country. This was their argument. And that the United States was bogged down in Iraq and Afghanistan On the other hand, there was a military presence of the US in the Persian Gulf, in Central Asia, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. So they will not attack Iran militarily, you know. Therefore, what will they do? They will try and overthrow the regime through through soft means. And they had studied very carefully what had happened in the Ukraine and what had happened in Georgia. So they were quite familiar with the concept of the Velvet Revolution. And they truly believe that institutions like ours, yours, and other institutions are part of the US government trying to enable the overthrow of the regime by inviting, you know, specialists, academics, civil society activists, and they really felt that they had convinced themselves, and there was no way you could have a counter argument with them. It just did not penetrate, no matter. I mean, I spent 8 months with these people trying to explain that this is not the case, but. You know.
Yeah, the Iranian ambassador kept telling me that, saying you don't understand how paranoid, or how he didn't use that word, but how suspicious they could be. So what should we be doing with Iran? And let's start with the more civil society, soft power. Should we even try?
I think the policy of the current administration, the policy of the Obama administration, I believe, has been brilliant and excellent, because they have reached out to Iran. They have talked about engagement. And they have shown to the leadership and to the people of Iran that they are not into overthrowing the regime. At least they have assured them. And so I believe this is one of the reasons that the Iranian finally accepted to come to Geneva, to come to Vienna, I mean, and talk about the nuclear issue. So at this stage, when the leadership of the reformist movement in Iran is sitting in jail and accused of promoting a velvet revolution, I don't think we can really once again talk about supporting civil society activities in Iran. But if you are approached, or if we are approached, I mean, if an institution is approached by an NGO in Iran or a civil society group in Iran who ask for help, we should, of course,
We've
answer.
been approached at the Aspen Zoo by an NGO to talk about more scientific exchanges. Okay. And this has just been discussed past few days. Should we do it?
Of course.
Okay.
Absolutely. I mean, I always, my argument is that the Iranian organizations are mature organizations, and if they approach you, it means that they are sure that nothing will happen to them. You know, and it's not, and basically, they are not suspicious of scientific approach. They are more suspicious if you bring a group of policymakers, or if you bring a group of journalists or women activists or university professors in the humanities. They are more suspicious of them.
And to get you onto the other policy level, what about the issues with Iran we have with nuclear weapons and all? How would you approach that?
I think the approach so far has been very good. I mean, we started talking to each other for the first time in 30 years, you know, in Geneva.
But if that doesn't work, and we've been reading the reports in the past couple of weeks.
I mean, I think if it doesn't work, I think we have to be a bit patient, because there is a lot of infighting and debate going on inside Iran over the nuclear issue. I'm sure that when President Ahmadinejad, of course with the tacit agreement of the leader, the supreme leader Ayatollah Khamenei, sent the head of the Iranian National Security Council to Geneva to make that proposal of sending low-enriched uranium to Russia. I mean, they didn't think that there will be such an opposition inside Iran. I mean, there is an amazing thing going on. Mr. Ahmadinejad's own party, the Speaker of Parliament, who is a conservative, all three former presidential candidates, Mr. Rezai, who was a conservative, Mousavi and Karoubi, the reformists, even former President Khatami, who had reached out to the states, all are against, this
The
proposal.
Russian
Yeah, this
solution.
proposal. So they have to sort out their problem inside Iran and then come back to the table. And I think, I personally don't think imposing sanctions will work in the immediate term. So I would advise for a bit of more patience.
So a bit of patience, let the internal politics sort out.
Yeah.
Then it gets sorted out. Obviously, if they say, okay, we'll send the uranium out, fine. If they get sorted out and they say, no, we're going to reject all deals, then you go to sanctions?
Then that's what the administration is talking about, and the French and the Germans and they're all going along, and I think Russia is even on board.
And that would would that work, you think? Severe, real sanctions, would that turn things around?
Until now, sanctions have not worked, and we just have to wait and see how severe those sanctions will be and whether it will work or not. I don't know.
How real is the democracy movement in Iran?
You mean the green movement?
Yes.
Now, it's very real, and it's there to stay. And because for the first time, it has galvanized a very wide spectrum of the people in Iran. And the reason, I think, was not only the pre-campaign participation of the young people in the elections, but it is the result of the atrocities and the human rights violation and the beating and the killing of the people saw in the streets. And it really has alienated a lot of people, ordinary citizens who were not at all involved in politics, just felt disgusted by what they saw on TV. So I think the movement might be now suppressed, but it's dormant probably, but it will not die out. And it will, every occasion, you will see more demonstrations, sporadic demonstration, unless the regime decides to reach out to these people. And so far, we haven't seen a sign of that.
I read somewhere that internet use in Iran was like 5th highest in the world per capita. I noticed that even the Supreme Leader has a blog, which I don't, but I always wanted to be called Supreme Leader, and I don't get that.
The president has the Iranian president has a blog. And so.
How much free flow of information is there, and how important is that in changing Iranian society?
There is a free flow of information, unlike any other country in the region, precisely because the sheer number of people who have access to the internet. There is also access to satellite dishes, so everybody watches either the Voice of America or the BBC or wherever they can get news, from us. So you are dealing with an educated, informed, political population. So they know exactly what is going on. And I think after the presidential elections, during the suppression and the fights in the streets, we saw that the government decided not to renew the license of the foreign journalists who were there. So little did they know that they had millions of young people on the streets with a cell phone, a Twitter, and sending out messages and sending SMSs and text message and videos. So you had suddenly 30 million journalists inside Iran rather than 15. So it's impossible to control this. It's impossible.
Thank goodness. Let me open it up, if I may.
Sure.
Yes. Hey, Beverly, is that you? I can't say I got a light in my eye. Why don't you everybody introduce themselves, but there's Beverly Kirk. Yeah.
Beverly Kirk with WJLA News Channel 8. I'm just curious about how the U.S. can help. You mentioned that if it's the U.S. government that is ever mentioned or involved with support of democracy programs. How best for regular Americans to let the people there in Iran know that they know their story and they're supporting them, because the president was criticized for his response, in the minds of many, the lack thereof, when the demonstrations were going on after the election. So what should the U.S. do?
I think it's unfair to criticize the president, because he spoke out when Neda Agha Sultan, that young woman, was killed in the street. The White House had been very open in condemning the atrocities and human rights. What one reads and hears is that in Geneva, on the side, Undersecretary Burns talked about the violation of human rights. So I think there is so much the United States and other countries can do, and that is continue condemning the violation of human rights. But this should not preclude or discussing the nuclear issues and the issues that Iran would like to put on the table. I think you should continue talking to the Iranians and, as I said, be patient. But I also would like to remind you that there are a lot of people, I mean, the leadership of the reformist movement is in jail. A lot of people were picked up on the street, young demonstrators, and we just heard that 8 of them were condemned to death. There are 3 American hikers sitting in Evin Prison. There is an Iranian American sociologist who was in jail when I was in jail, was again picked up, and this time sentenced to 12 years imprisonment. You should talk about them. I mean, continue talking. That's the way
That's
you
a
can
good
help.
point, because in your book, I noticed, like, when the New York Times had David Rode in captivity with the Taliban, there was a cone of silence over it, thinking that was the best approach, not to raise it. With you, everybody on Massachusetts Avenue was calling every foreign minister they knew, from Bernard Kouchner on, to elevate your situation. Is that the proper approach when somebody's being held, to make it into a big issue, including the hikers, including you?
Sure.
Okay.
I really believed in my case it helped. At some stage, they really got, the Iranian foreign minister got sick and tired of receiving so many phone calls regarding me. And at the end, of course, it was Lee Hamilton who wrote a letter to the supreme leader. But it does help to raise a lot of awareness of what is going on, because the Iranians are concerned about their image, you know. And so it doesn't, yeah.
Thanks. I'm Gary Mitchell. One of the issues that has gotten sort of swept aside in this focus that we have on the nuclear issue is, of course, Iran's financing of Hamas, Hezbollah, et cetera. The question that I'd be interested in hearing you talk about is whether this syndicate of terror that really is the nexus of which is Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, others thrown in, that we see gaining strength in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Whether or not that is a development that the regime in Iran fears may interfere in Iranian affairs, spilling over the borders, and if not replacing the U.S. as the evil empire, giving them another enemy. I mean, to what extent is that sort of on the radar screen of the leadership, and how worried are they about it? The flip side of that question, of course, is, depending upon your answer, is there some likelihood that on the long haul, Iran can be something of an ally for the U.S. In its attempt to settle things down in Afghanistan and with the Taliban?
Good question.
Iran in the past helped the United States in Bonn when the talks were going on to form the first Afghan government. Iran was, and the ambassador, Mr. Zarif,
sure,
was very instrumental in really putting together these different factions in Afghanistan and helped the United States. And I'm sure that it would like to help again, because for the life of me, I don't think Iran would like to have an unsettled, countries around at its borders. But it wants to be recognized as a player in Afghanistan. It has a very important role to play in Iraq, whether we like it or not. The government is Shiite, the majority of the population are Shiite. Iran supported the Shiite group when Saddam was in power. So for the Shiite, it was, they had to pay back Iran. So Iran would like to have a role there. But I think it probably will cooperate with the United States in Afghanistan and in Iraq. But Hamas and Hezbollah is a different story. It's not on Iran's border. That's one thing. And secondly, Iran wants to be seen as a very important regional power. And the way it can flex its muscle is by financing Hezbollah and Hamas. And so if there is a negotiation over these issues, Iran wants to have a seat on the table.
Did Iran help with the formation of the recent Lebanese government when that logjam was broken finally in Hezbollah, in Lebanon, Beirut, and Hezbollah allowed the formation of a government?
I think they probably had a say indirectly because they finance Hezbollah, right. So they have an influence on them, sure. Okay. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, we're there, and then David, yeah.
Ronald Steele, University of Southern
California. Hey, Ronald, I'm sorry. I should have recognized you.
He's an old friend.
Yeah, that's right.
I wonder, how would you describe the feeling of average Iranians or the majority of Iranians on the issue of nuclear weapons, considering the fact that there's already one nuclear power in the Middle East, which the United States supports and has supported, and of course Israel, and has supported all along. Would there be a significant number of people in Iran who are opposed to the government and most of the practices that you've described in human rights, et cetera, but who feel that Iran, as a great nation, has the right to develop nuclear weapons?
If there is one consensus among the people, is the right of Iran to have access to the nuclear program for peaceful purposes, And so that they all agree. I mean, if this is a rallying point, it's a matter of pride, it's a matter of power, but I'm not so sure whether the majority of the people are aware of what it takes to make that leap to the becoming a weaponized program. So on the whole, I think they would agree. But they will not have an issue if the regime, the President Ahmadinejad's government, comes to an agreement with the United States and the West over, the enrichment of uranium, over really very strict inspection. They don't have a problem with that. Because what has changed, I think, Ron, is that you have in this country a president who is very popular, still very popular, in the region and in Iran. So the government in Iran can no longer go around and say, we have an enemy sitting across the water from us who doesn't want us to have access to our program for peaceful purposes.
But then why was there such a political backlash among the political leadership against the Russian uranium enrichment plan?
Mm-hmm. First of all, they don't trust the Russian. The Russians have been working on the Bushehr plant for the last 30 years, and they have not delivered. This is number one. Number two, this is an infighting. I mean, why should President Ahmadinejad get the credit for talking to the Americans when President Khatami and the reformists were stopped from doing it? So the reason is now internal and has nothing to do with the white foreign policy thing. Thirdly, you have a supreme leader who doesn't make decisions easily. And he basically does not want to have relations with the United States. At this stage, if you could find a way of settling the nuclear issue without having a representation in Iran or in the United States, he would be happy with it.
The supreme leader, but not
Sure.
the Iranian people.
No, not the Iranian people. The Iranian people would like to have relations with them. I mean, they would like to come and visit their uncles and aunts and cousins who live in this country, and they don't want to go through Dubai and wait for 6 weeks or 6 months and not get a visa. No, they really, and they would like to come and study here. You know, we are losing a whole generation of young Iranians by stopping them from coming here and studying here.
Why is the supreme leader against it? Theological reason, so to speak?
No, not theological reason. It's a political reason. I mean, from day one, I mean, one of the pillars of the revolution was, you know, enmity to the United States, and why should he suddenly overturn it? You know?
David.
This is sort of a follow-up on something that Walter mentioned earlier. If there were sanctions placed on Iran, for example, limiting the import of gasoline and petroleum products, refined petroleum products, do you think the hardships suffered by the people would be blamed on the West that imposed the sanctions or on the government? In other words, would they rally around the government in their hardship, or would they really put pressure on the government to get them out of the predicament that they would see the government placing them in?
I would say on both. I mean, they would blame their own government because there was an administration at this end who was reaching out to them, and they didn't do enough to reciprocate. But then at the end, you know, when you can't put food on the table for your child day after day, week after week, month after month, and then of course you would blame the perpetrator, and they would say, okay, you know. But I think that sanctions, no matter how hard it is, will not work. I truly don't. Iran is a very wealthy country. Oil is now almost again at $70. And
Really?
they will, you know, and they have that income. And I'm sure they will find a way to smuggle gasoline around, across the border. And the United States has not been able to stop Dubai really from allowing you know, exports to go into Iran and so on. So as long as you can smuggle things, you have access to land routes through Turkey, through Iraq, and then also the sea route to the Persian Gulf, it would be very difficult to impose sanctions. To work, for sanctions to work, you can impose it, but
Fred.
it will not work.
Thank you.
I'm Fred Hyatt. The events after the election this summer were described by some people as a kind of coup by the elements of the intelligence agencies or the Revolutionary Guards against even the clerical establishment. And you know, there's a lot of attempt to interpret the show trials and who was trying to send messages to who. Can you talk a little bit more about what's going on inside the regime and where you think that may lead?
I was very surprised as a student of Iran to see that the government resorted to the Revolutionary Guards and brought them out into the streets to suppress the demonstrations. Basically, the demonstrations were not violent. I mean, all they did, the demonstrators, the millions who came out into the streets were calling and asking, where is our vote? That's all they wanted. They were hoping that the supreme leader will go out and say, okay, we'll have a recount or something like that. But that was a big surprise to me. But then, if one looks back, ever since President Ahmadinejad came to power, there was a rise among the security forces. You had the intelligence ministry people, which became very powerful, and which arrested basically me and the others. And I give a long description about the rise of the intelligence ministry and the Revolutionary Guards in my book. But then they started the intelligence ministry and the Revolutionary Guards were working hand in hand, but it was not so noticeable. What also happened under President Ahmadinejad was that the Revolutionary Guards became a player in the economic part of the country. They got not much, maybe 10%, 20%, because now we hear these exaggerated figures, but it's not the case. But they became gradually also an economic power within the system. And so when they decided to go after the demonstrators, they just had to turn to them and to the paramilitary Basijis and the plainclothes policemen. And you have now, in the Revolutionary Guard, a new leadership. The old leadership, the guards who took part in the war with Iraq, they all have retired or are marginalized. So you have this new echelon who run the Revolutionary Guard, who owe their allegiance to the supreme leader, and they take their order from him, and to President Ahmadinejad, who has given them a free hand. And for the first time, you see commanders of the Revolutionary Guard discussing politics, coming out and making statements about Khatami, Karoubi, Mousavi, and what one is told, and I don't have a way to prove it, is that it is the intelligence section of the Revolutionary Guard who went around and arrested the leadership of the reformist movement and put them on trial, these show trials. So they are there to stay. And I personally think that the genie is out of the bottle, and one of these days it might come and haunt the people who brought them out into the street.
Explain the president's firing of the intelligence chief, then.
Because of me?
Yeah, but I mean, well.
I think that, again, this is hearsay, that the head of the intelligence, the former intelligence minister, was against the show trial. And there was really a lot of discussion going on among various groups of the intelligence ministry, how to handle the people who were arrested, how to handle the leadership of the reformist movement. And this goes back to my time. When I was in prison, there was a division between the minister and some of his deputies, and then other deputies. There were those who would say, look, let her go. It's not worth our while to keep her. And others would argue that, no, let's put her in prison. And the other side, of course, the intelligence minister won, and I ended up in solitary confinement for 105 days. So I think this time, in order to stop this argument and in order to stop this whole business of shall we do this, shall we not do this, Ahmadinejad decided to fire his intelligence minister.
And the current intelligence minister is beholden to the Revolutionary Guard?
Exactly. He was the representative of the supreme leader for a while in the Revolutionary Guard, and he's very close to them, he's very close to the president.
Sure. And is there a closeness that's inseparable between the Revolutionary Guard and the theocracy and supreme leaders?
Nothing is inseparable in Iran, seriously. You see that there is a big cleavage now among the the high-level ayatollahs in Iran. There is a big difference between the ayatollahs who are sitting in Qom and the supreme leader. And there is the same thing, I would say, among the Revolutionary Guards too. But the new commanders all owe their allegiance to the supreme leader. And I mean, if the supreme leader was going to reach out to the people, he probably would have asked the commander to go back to their barracks, but he hasn't done so.
What power do the clerical group in Qom have?
I think originally they could have been very forceful and could have had a lot of power. But now, I think, again, I mean, they knew that if they go beyond a certain point, the regime can silence them by just what they did to Ayatollah Montazeri, to just put them under so-called house arrest and so on. But they have shown that, at least a number of them, that they will not be easily co-opted. There is no way they can be co-opted.
I was surprised at how courageous, in some ways, they seem to be.
Yeah.
Is there questions? Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I'm Cherie Lustino. I direct the Office of the Middle East at the Department of Commerce. I was interested in your comment about the fact that it's an educated and informed population, and that this green movement, therefore, isn't going to die. How far out of the major cities does it go? I have heard that the population outside of the major the people outside of the major population centers are less engaged or in this green movement. Is that would you agree?
Yeah. If we accept that the elections were really rigged and Mr. Mousavi would have won the first round, not even gone to the second round.
And do you accept that, by the way?
I personally accept that. And then we have to accept that his vote came from around the country and not necessarily big cities. And he was, associated with the Green Movement. The Green Movement was his. So therefore, the Green Movement must have been widespread, if we accept that. So of course, in the major cities, the Green Movement was much more active, more open, and it is still more active. Just on November 4th, on the anniversary of the hostage taking, I mean, the demonstrations were not only in Tehran, they were in Shiraz, Isfahan, Tabriz, in the major cities. But then, if you look at the votes, it must be widespread.
What about the women's movement now?
The campaign. 3 years ago, a group of Iranian women and men got together and started something called the campaign to collect 1 million signatures to promote equality for men and women under the law. And they have been very active, and they are actually going even to small villages, their representative explaining what it is all about, and it is within Islamic law, and they are basically, all they want is to promote equality, and they are collecting signature. And I was just talking to one of the campaign women yesterday, who happened to be in town. She was very, very young, a woman in her early 20s, maybe she was 21-year-old, and she would say that oddly enough, while before the elections and so on, it was very difficult and hard. You had to convince for people to sign. She said just during the election campaign and after the election, these young women who would go and collect signatures would say, people would come up to them and say, just don't waste your time explaining to us. We'll just sign and then move on, So there is that. The women are really the force behind major changes inside Iran.
And that continues after the repression?
Oh, sure.
And the campaign, so to speak,
yeah, it's called
with a capital
campaign.
T, capital
yeah.
C.
Yeah.
must be at least tolerated by both the clerics and the Revolutionary Guard.
Well,
That's a question mark at the end of that
no,
sentence, right?
no. I think some of the clerics, there are a number of very high-level clerics who support the campaign and have spoken in favor of the campaign. Have not signed it, but have spoken in favor of the campaign. But I don't think the Revolutionary Guards have come out and in support of the campaign.
I didn't mean support.
No, but
tolerate.
Yeah, I doubt it at this stage, because for them, any kind of gathering is one step closer to the Velvet Revolution. And they are, when I was in prison, my interrogators would tell me that, look, I mean, we can deal with student demonstrations, we can deal with workers' demonstrations, but we can't deal with women. I mean, if 1 million of them come out into the street, how would we deal with them? And really, this was a problem. And that's why they kept on and continue to this day arresting members of the campaign, send them to Evin, keep them there for a while, put some on trial, send some back home, and then go and rearrest them. So they are really more worried, more concerned about the women's movement in Iran than any other organization.
Are they right?
Sure. Okay. Look, whatever the Iranian, I mean, the changes that you have seen taking place in Iran is because of the women. I mean, your three presidential candidates all talked about women's issues. Mr. Mousavi had his wife at his side and walking hand in hand with her, and she would always be the first speaker in the campaign because he was such a dull speaker. The second one, Mr. Karoubi talked about appointing a woman foreign minister in Iran to be able to sit and negotiate with Hillary Clinton. Mr. Rezai, the former commander of the Revolutionary Guard, had a woman advisor. You know, he had an advisor for women affairs, a woman. So they all, for them, the women's vote matters. And Mr. Ahmadinejad, despite the opposition of his conservatives in Rome, the clerical community, and his conservative fellows in parliament, nominated 3 women to his cabinet. 2 were rejected, 1 was approved. This is the first time in the last 30 years that you have a woman minister. She's terribly, she's very conservative, right, but there is a woman minister. So why that? Because of the women constituency.
There seems to be a lot more democracy in Iran than you, I mean, everything you've talked about is democratic wellspringing.
Sure, there is, you know, and that's why I think whatever is taking place in Iran is indigenous and is from within the society. So therefore, if they tell us, don't, I mean, the civil society people tell us, don't interfere, don't say anything, I think we should just be guided by them rather than by what we hear at this end.
And the woman who runs the campaign, or not runs it, but the young woman, yeah, is it dangerous for her to keep coming to the United States?
No, I think she didn't. She said, they might arrest me when I go back.
That sounds dangerous, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, but still, they are bold enough to come, yeah, and to talk and, you know, go around and, you know, talk about the campaign and then go back. I mean, when I was in prison, they would arrest these campaign women and bring them, and the way I would walk in and out of Starbucks, these young women would come in and out of prison. I mean, they would come there, stay a week, go out, and continue being active. They really are just fearless. They are not intimidated or anything by any kind of pressure.
The same could be said of you, and that's very reflected in this book. Good luck with the book. Please buy it. This will continue as an informal conversation, but this was totally inspiring. Really was inspiring. Thank you so very much.
My congratulations.
What?
You should go back.
Oh, no, that's all right. That's no big deal.